one.
Excellent. Thank you, Nia, and thank you, Zoom Voice. Tonight is Building Self-Determination Part 2. All right. Getting organized and building wealth under the dominant economic system can feel like an endless battle. Don't you know it? Our ancestors and forebears organized against a backdrop of racial capitalism. Our peers continue the fight. Join us in learning with Dr. Charisse Burden Stelly how racial capitalism structured and continues to structure domination, while foregrounding how members of the African diaspora challenge, resist, and build against exploitation within the United States. We'll learn from Black-led movements and organizations, picking up strategies, failures, and wins to carry forward and pull into our own protracted struggles. Once again, this is part 2, following up from last week. I'm going to now read the bio for Dr. Charisse Burden Stelly, otherwise known as Dr. CBS. Dr. CBS is an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. She's the author of Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, the co-author of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and co-editor of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings and Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Post-Colonial State. She is currently working on her second single-authored book, Against Imperialism, Mutual Comradeship, and Black Liberation in the McCarthy Era. Dr. Burden Stelly's writings appear in peer-reviewed journals including Small Axe, Souls, Du Bois Review, Socialism and Democracy, International Journal of Africana Studies, C.L.R. James Journal, and American Communist History. Her public scholarship can be found in publications such as Essence Magazine, The Nation, Monthly Review, Teen Vogue, Boston Review, hey, Hammer and Hope, hey, Jewish Currents, and Black Agenda Report, triple yay. She is a member of Black Alliance for Peace and the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. Please give a warm in-person and emoji online round of applause to Dr. CBS. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Hey y'all, thank you for having me and thank you all for being here. Um, if you don't mind being recorded, I would love to see your shining faces. Thank you to all who are have their cameras on. The black square gives me PTSD to teaching during when the pandemic first hit. Um, but you know, self-determination, do you. Okay, so I'm going to split this talk kind of into two parts. The first is going to be about repression, and the second is going to be going over some concepts, and then each of these sections will have its own kind of discussion section. I want us to be able to be interactive, so um, that is what we will do. And I will try to leave us as much time as possible for discussion. And so I'm just going to revisit the organizations that I spoke about last week, which, as a reminder, were the Daughters of Africa. I talked about Marcus Garvey, W.B. Du Bois, Harry Haywood, James Foreman, and Red Thread. So that's the organizations and individuals and these different types of financial governance in which they engage. And so I'll just talk a little bit about the repression that each of these individuals, organizations, and ideas face, because again, if we're thinking dialectically, we have to think not only about, so we call this, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's not exactly what dialectics is, but it's a good way to think about it. Okay, so remember, the Daughters of Africa was a 1820s mutual aid organization. Now, even though there wasn't perhaps the direct forms of repression, I'll talk about facing other people in a little bit. They were free Black women primarily during the antebellum period, right? So during the period when the majority of Black people were enslaved, meaning that they faced rampant segregation, that they were foreclosed from most skilled professions, especially women, and that over time for Black men, the right to vote, which they had enjoyed after the Revolutionary War, was systematically eroded. So in New Jersey, The black male vote was taken away in 1807. It was taken in Connecticut. It was taken away in 1818 from black men who had not voted previously. In 1821, it was taken away from all black men except for property owners. And it was taken away completely in Pennsylvania in 1838. And so you know that if you do not have the vote, you cannot protect your wealth, right? Um, and so this I just focused on the Northeast because that is where this organization was situated. So here we might think about how laws, acts, in particular government policy are used as a form of repression. Now, Marcus Garvey, I talked about his sort of black cooperative capitalism last week. So Marcus Garvey was actually convicted of mail fraud in 1924, I believe, and was ultimately deported in 1927. He was hounded by J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover is a sort of recurring character in terms of both anti-radical and anti-black repression in the United States. And so in terms of mail fraud, we might think about the ways that all of these different kind of machinations by the state are used to accuse Black people or to kind of condemn Black people of engaging in economic practices. And then, of course, he was deported. Many of our comrades who are radicals and organizing for self-determination have different sort of levels of citizenship, right? And so deportation was a key weapon that was used against radicals and Black radicals in particular. So here we might think about how our relationship to citizenship can be used as a means of repression, right? I also talked last week about W.B. Du Bois's advocacy of Black cooperatives in the 1930s. Du Bois was hounded throughout his life from when he worked for the NAACP and was editor of Crisis through to his joining the Communist Party in 1961 and ultimately leaving the United States and dying in exile in Ghana in 1963. But so he was under surveillance for majority of that time. He also had his passport suspended in the 1950s, he and people like Paul Robeson, because of their radical politics. And so here we might think about how both surveillance and also the circumscription or the kind of curtailment, I'm trying to use the words other than those, how affecting our movement, our ability to move or to leave is used as forms of repression, right? Next, we have Harry Haywood. I talked about Harry Haywood in the context of the Black Belt thesis. And Haywood was a member of the Communist Party. And the only thing that the United States hates more than Black people is communists. Let me tell you that much. And so communists, especially because they organized interracially, and especially in the US South, were hounded by local police. They were hounded by the FBI, civil society organizations, and especially the Ku Klux Klan. They were often beaten by police for engaging in strikes, for organizing interracially. And so they were often subjected to abuse by the state, by civil society, and by individuals all of the time. And so here we might think about how people who don't necessarily have state power, but who are invested in the reproduction of racial capitalism, which we'll talk about later on, are the sort of foot soldiers or the stormtroopers of repression. Now, repression is not only engendered by the state or the federal government, but also ordinary citizens. James Forman. I talked about him in the context of the Black Manifesto, which he produced in the 1970s. And we all are probably most familiar with COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. So James Forman was hounded as the aspect of COINTELPRO that was focused on quote unquote Black nationalist hate groups and threats to internal security. And so here, COINTELPRO used all sorts of techniques from infiltration to Fed jacketing, implanting the ideas that members of particular organizations were federal agents when they were not, to sow paranoia and dissent. They used all kinds of tactics to turn comrades against each other, to turn organizations against each other. They just used straight up like state violence. We understand that SWAT teams, for example, were formed as a response to and as an extension of COINTELPRO to target primarily Black liberation and radical organizations. So here we might think about how are the police used, right? The police, how is the actual function of the police, not just happenstance. Well, how is the function of the police to repress us, especially when we are engaging in aspects of self-determination? And then finally, I talked about Red Thread, which is a Guyanese women's organization that formed in the 2000s, well, the 1990s, but changed kind of direction in the 2000s, that was focused on getting ordinary working class women remuneration for their unwaged and low wage work. And so they organize around all kinds of things, including sexual violence and environmental concerns, right? Because as we know, Guyana has oil, and anytime you have natural resources as a country or as a community, the capitalists are going to come and try to take over your shit. And so this organization has received death threats. They've, been subjected to other forms of violence in attempts to silence their activism, and especially in their attempts to interrupt gender-based violence. And so here again, we might think about the ways that these forms of repression are gendered and how they are directly related to our attempts to defend our communities against all sorts of things, from resource extraction to gentrification. So that is a lot of information laid out there. And so I want to give you all maybe 2 or 3 minutes to really think about what are the methods of repression we face currently, but also how do we fight against them? So thinking about how is repression used to undermine our ability to govern, to be, to engage in financial governance in a way that uplifts our community. So what are the methods of repression we currently face, and how can we fight against them? And so you could drop some answers in the chat. You could just jot them down on your own. You could turn to your neighbor if you're in person, but then we'll come back in a couple minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so we got some great ideas in the chat. So feel free to hop off of mute and share some ideas. In the chat, we have ICE detention, censorship and federal funding cuts, fragmentation of Black neighborhoods and displacement of Black geographies, erasure of cultural memory. We have incarceration, especially to punish people who hold politics against the status quo. We got doxing, nonprofitization, reinforcement of harmful Black narratives like the Black welfare queen, poor people are lazy, etc. So these are all really good.
We have one comment in person, Dr. TBS.
Yeah, we were discussing birthright citizenship.
What's that?
So currently, like the discussions at the Supreme Court level of revoking your citizenship by way of you being born here. And we talked about referencing how citizenship is a tool, like you said, to limit where people can go, where they can be, and how they can voice their opinions in a certain place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what's important to note is that birthright citizenship comes out of the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is the Reconstruction Amendment. It's the 13th, 14th, and 15th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It's the 14th Amendment, I believe so. It's one of the Reconstruction Amendments, which means that birthright citizenship was established through Black freedom, right? And so there's this idea that it only applies to people kind of out there, but African Americans are at the center, especially, one example of this, if think about, your family members, especially, right, older family members who don't have papers. They were born here, but they might not have a birth certificate. They might not have a social security number. They might not have literal sort of documents to prove their citizenship. They might have they might never have had them, especially if they're born in particular rural areas. And so it's not just people, quote unquote foreigners, right? It applies to people here. Moreover, there's a long history of efforts to denaturalize and take away people's citizenship. One is the Internal Security Act of 1950. And some aspects of that law still remain. Much of it was overturned, but some of those aspects still remain. And that law was meant to strip people of naturalization and citizenship because of their political beliefs and their political ideas. And we can see that we're again moving in that direction. That I write about in some of my work that foreignness is not just about a country that you were born in. It also is the way that particular groups that are already deemed other espouse ideas that challenge the state, right? That are said to be foreign inspired or subversive. So how do these forms of oppression directly impact financial governance? How do they directly impact our ability to be self-determining? What do y'all think? Go ahead, Bria.
Yeah, so I think about that question in relation to the point I had said about incarceration. It definitely, when people are incarcerated, it definitely has a strain on the community. As far as like the family of those who of the person who is incarcerated, then having to like find ways to support the person inside, and also depending on who that person was, if they were like a breadwinner or whatever, it impacts that family's ability to survive just like on their own because they no longer have a means of income. And also on a more like a broader level, when certain areas are heavily policed and people and have high like incarceration rates, those neighborhoods also face uh, like there's a correlation between those neighborhoods facing like just financial difficulties and the means to like be self-determining and survive because of incarceration and uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, I can't find the word, but hopefully like you get the point.
Yeah, so it's expensive to be poor, right? There's like a poverty tax in this country. And if you think about like the most dispossessed areas, these are typically food deserts. These are areas in which the few businesses that are there, such as liquor stores and check cashing spots, right? These are not owned by Black people for the quote unquote Black capitalists among us, right? These are places that don't have parks, they don't have public space. The schools are usually not good because schools are related to the tax base of a given area. And that, by the way, that is not inevitable. That was a Reagan thing. So there's no reason why the money that schools get have to come from the amount of property taxes that are paid. There's no reason that has to be the financial model. And so if you so all of these things kind of work together. So there's a level of extraction and exploitation and expropriation that happens in these communities, and incarceration is just like kind of one tactic of that. Anything else? Yes, organized abandonment. What do you mean by this? Is it Kemi or Kimi? 2/3 of my heart is incarcerated. What do you mean by that? Yeah, I have loved ones that are incarcerated. Absolutely, for sure. Okay. Are there any other ideas before we move on to some of the other concepts? I just some feedback from last week was that we wanted it to be a little bit more dialogical, give you guys time to process and to kind of chat. So I want to make sure that I'm holding space for that for us to think together. Okay. So I'll move. Oh, go ahead, Phoebe.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. I was just gonna say, like, keeping people too much in survival mode, like trying to survive paycheck to paycheck, to like thinking that they're too tired or too overwhelmed to think of like bigger picture stuff and come together with other people for larger structural change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. Make it so we can't even afford to pay attention. Okay. So now I want to just talk about three concepts that relate to this idea of financial governance. So racial capitalism, internal colonialism, and self-determination. And I'm just going to give some quick and dirty kind of information about these things so that, again, we can get to kind of the discussion and thinking together. So the idea of racial capitalism in its very simplest form is just the idea that when the capitalist world economy took off, right? Racism was concomitant, or racism also arose alongside it. So that really, to understand how racism and racial domination work, we have to understand capitalism. And to understand capitalism, we have to pay attention to these different racial dynamics and logics. Capitalism, when we think about class is a relationship to the mode of production. It's about who owns the means of production and who has to sell their labor for wages. Now, when we add race into the mix, there's not only those who are exploited, i.e., those who sell their labor for wages, there are also those who are super exploited, and those tend to be the racialized and colonized people. So, what does that mean? It means that those who are kind of racialized, suffer a form of exploitation because it's coupled with oppression that is over and above that of like the white working class, right? So this means that, and this is manifest in a number of ways, one of which is like you're completely locked out of certain industries, last hired, first fired. You make way less for doing the same amount of work. So for example, Black women were almost whole, like a huge portion of Black women were represented in service work, particularly domestic work, up until like the 1970s and 1980s, because they couldn't get jobs anywhere else. And what tends to happen is that political economy shapes and is shaped by social relations. So if you only see Black women as maids, for example, you begin to think that Black women are innately or objectively servants of others, right? And so there's a way that your ideas about people are shaped by the type of work that they do or don't do, as well as other narratives. Racial capitalism is also this idea that of in my book I talk about something called ongoing primitive accumulation, and this is an idea that comes from like Rosa Luxemburg and some other political theorists, But the idea of primitive accumulation is that before kind of capitalism was consolidated, there were forms of what's called plunder. So there's ways that, you know, the Europeans came in and would just kind of take people's shit, right? It wasn't exploitation. It wasn't people selling their stuff. It was just taking it. So slavery will be a form of primitive accumulation. Working indigenous folks in mines to death, literally taking stuff. And so the idea of primitive accumulation is that this kind of robbery was the basis for capital accumulation. But the idea of ongoing primitive accumulation is that this form of plunder is ongoing. We continue to see it, right? So this is what it continues to happen in the global South, right? Whereas people with particular citizenship or a particular status sell their labor for wages, there are whole groups of people where their labor is just stolen from them in the form of slavery or near slavery, or they are like structurally unemployed. You have places in the global South where their governments are toppled to take their resources, and the resources that belong to those people are taken to the benefit of us in the global North. These are forms of ongoing primitive accumulation because they're accompanied by like violence. So all of that to say, the idea of racial capitalism is not to say that there's one capitalism that is racialized and one that is not, but rather that there are racial dynamics, racialized dynamics that are always part and parcel of capitalism, and that the racial oppression that we suffer has a capitalist basis. So there's a bunch more to say about that, but that's something that we need to understand. And so let us think about, when we're thinking about financial governance, what is that? What are the possibilities, but also what are the limitations in a system of racial capitalism? And also we might think about what is the system that needs to be in place in order for those impediments to governance not to, or financial governance not to exist, right? So in other words, if we want to be okay financially, ecologically, spiritually, all of these things, what kind of system do we need to have? So the next term is internal colonialism. And so this is the argument that the Black community, politically, economically, and militarily, is subjugated by white America, just as colonies in Africa or Asia or Latin America are colonially subjugated under the direct rule of European powers. And so this is the idea that colonies do not need to be external, that they can also be internal, i.e., happening in the landmass itself. And so Indian reservations or urban ghettos inhabited by African Americans and other racialized groups will be a sort of representation of an internal colony. And so what's critical about a colonial relationship and its structures is this relationship of domination and subordination. And part of understanding Black people as an internal or a domestic colony is that the way that we experience domination is not just mere discrimination or exclusion. It is national in character. It is similar to the ways that colonized people experience oppression. And so appealing to the law is not enough. It is part of it, right? Gaining citizenship is part of it, but there's a broader and more revolutionary process that's necessary to overthrow structures of colonialism. And so then the examples that people give of how the domestic colony functions is that, like, for example, Black people lack control in the cities in which they live, and their capital and cheap labor is exploited by white people who live elsewhere. And so that the main kind of commodity or resource that Black people have is their labor. So cheap, unskilled labor is extracted right from these internal colonies and used for a rapidly expanding economy, or it's even a shifting economy. And so the point is that Black people don't really own, don't have a sort of economic or political control over the areas in which we're concentrated. And when we think about how the military operates in colonies, it is similar or very much related to how the police operate in our communities, the communities in which we're warehoused. the violence that we face is very similar. And so the other function of understanding our conditions as colonial as opposed to simply racial is that our struggles are linked to those who are in the global south. So what's happening in Haiti, or what's happening in Johannesburg, or what's happening in Cuba or Venezuela or Iran, etc., is linked to what is happening to Black people and other internally colonized people here. And then this leads us to the question of self-determination and what exactly self-determination is. And there's a lot of different kind of definitions of what this is. So I'm just going to read one by Lenin that was also used by Harry Haywood. And so according to Lenin, self-determination implies the application of consistent democracy and the sphere of relations between nations, the elimination of the forcibly imposed distinction between oppressed and oppressing nations. It means the abolition of all and sundry privileges of one nation over the other. And recall that Black people, in Harry Haywood's logic, Black people constitute a nation, right? That and we're a national group, not just a racial group. So Lenin goes on to say, specifically, it means simply the right of the people of a nation to determine their own fate or destiny, free from forcible intervention from without by the people of another nation. A nation has the right to organize its own life in the manner or form it chooses, independent of the dictates of any other nation, to be master in its own house. Finally, self-determination means the recognition of the sovereignty of a people in all matters affecting their internal life, as well as in matters involving their relationships with other peoples or nations. This then is the content and principle of the right to self-determination, right? So that means that the things that affect you, you get to have a say in, and that you are not subjected to the whims, desires, dictates, or necessity of an external nation or people. And that the resources, the value, etc., that you produce belong to you and the people. They cannot be extracted or stolen or plundered for the enrichment of another group. And so we can see how these ideas of racial capitalism, internal colonialism, and self-determination are linked. Internal colonialism is a reality of a racial capitalist society, right? It is the operating of imperialism in the belly of the beast, so to speak. And self-determination is an outcome of overthrowing racial capitalism and of liberating the internal colonies. So the question that I want us to think about for a couple of minutes on our own is, how can we use financial governance to fortify our internal colonies against racial capitalism to achieve self-determination? So how can we use financial governance, or how is financial governance a tool to fortify or to defend our internal colonies against racial capitalism to achieve self-determination? So financial governance isn't, so that's just kind of the theme of, this is something maybe Gio can answer, because I think that this is a concept that your organization is working with, right? Is financial governance.
Yes. Our annual theme is organizing for financial governance. I'm going to put the accompanying Ujima Wednesdays link in the chat. that explains the scope of our year of workshops and defines that in particular. Just a moment, but please continue your discussions amongst yourselves as well. I'll put it in the chat to keep it consistent.
So this concept, marinage or marooning, has come up a couple of times. So I heard there was this provocation. I think it was from Max, maybe from what's the organization called? We'll come to Paka. Paka, and he said, I think it was him. You could be a maroon, or you can be a revolutionary, but you cannot be both at the same time. And I always thought that that's something I think about often, that you could be a maroon or you could be a revolutionary, but you can't be both. And the interesting, so I said you could be a maroon or you could be a revolutionary, but you can't be both. I don't know if that was louder, JM. But the other interesting thing about maroons is, well, because think about why can't you be both, right? Marinaging, so marinage, right, maroonage is about forging community and self-determination in the context of the extant system. So if we think about like maroons, right, maroons who escaped slave plantations and formed quilombos and, you know, communities in the Great Dismal Swamp here, for example, they are forming communities, but not necessarily without overthrowing the slave system. Revolutionaries like Nat Turner, for example, are trying to overthrow this system, or John Brown. And so there's not a value judgment that is placed on one or the other. They're different strategies. But if you're building a sort of separate, we could think about it sort of maybe like dual power, or we could think about them perhaps as stages, right? The process of marinage is a precondition to building revolutionary power, perhaps. But the projects are distinct, right? The survival skills or the survival strategy, they're distinct as survival strategies. But I'm open to hearing pushback or ideas about how they can coexist, or any other thing that you all are thinking about in terms of the question about financial governance.
It's not something that. Oh, wait, are we answering in person or are we writing?
No, you can talk. Yeah, just talk off.
It's something that I've been thinking about much more deeply, and I haven't had a chance to fully process it. But when I think of marinage, like in context to the like the Garifuna, I think how it was explained to me is that their system is volatile, which means that their autonomy of choice is often switching based off of the external pressures. So in my mind, if it's constantly shifting from where they have autonomy to depending on a different role, based off of the resources that they have available, that the idea or concept of them exclusively being marinage could also filter into revolutionary, depending on the role that they're playing at that time. And this is based off of readings from, it's called Constructing Worlds Otherwise by Raul, I think Zibecki is his last name. I'm still learning about it. So this was new. This was a new frame for me. And I appreciate it.
Well, the interesting thing about some Maroons, like in the historical context, was that they entered into various negotiations and treaties with, like, the British, for example, with slaveholders, and some returned runaway enslaved Africans to plantations as part of those agreements. And so we also have to think about that reality, right? And so Maroonage is not objectively, or need not objectively lead to or be revolutionary if we think about that context, right? That part of the survival of that group was contingent upon the unfreedom or circumscribing the freedom of other groups. But this is also reality. This, we can name many examples of this, right? The ways that people understand their freedom or their relative privilege to be directly related to the demise or the oppression of another group. And so that is something that needs to be, that's just the reality of perhaps being a human being trying to challenge these structures. So in the last sort of minute or two, just anything, if you all want to share anything that you're thinking about, what are you kind of walking away with? Anything you want to contribute to sort of feel complete?
Um, this is Donna. I think now I'm beginning to believe that it's both and other. I feel like it's how do we survive collectively, and how we have survived collectively is through all these methods. But often we were at odds with each other about which one to choose, and I think with the way capitalism is on steroids, that we have to find a way to survive it, just to survive. And I think it's anything that helps us survive, we have to find a way to hold for ourselves.
That's real. I think that the question is, what does it take to move from sort of survival, right, to thriving or flourishing? And it might take, how do we do all of these things to get, or can we do all of these different strategies in ways that aren't antagonistic? What happens when you feel like your freedom or privilege is contingent on the others not having that, right? But let me quickly address this idea about capitalism or racial capitalism. I think that the thing about saying racial capitalism is to keep it front and center how racism and racial domination is a material practice. And so it's specifying what it is that we're talking about. And so you can just say capitalism, but often when we just say capitalism, we're thinking about like a very particular or it's naming like a very particular process, like the exchange of goods and services in the marketplace or whatever. And so when we say racial capitalism, we're not only naming a system, but also a whole trajectory of political and intellectual thought meant to um, describe and analyze the system from the perspective of the sufferers, right? So it's an open question, and it's one that is ongoing, this debate about racial capitalism. But that would be sort of my response to that. A maroon society, that is one way, right? The question is, what is our responsibility to each other, right? Because part of what marronage is a sort of it's an autarkic existence, meaning that you produce and consume and kind of organize for self like self the group self, right? And so then again, if we're thinking about revolution requires building up a mass base, and it is sort of not necessarily opposite to, but it's a different method of organizing. So again, so yes, marronage might be one approach, but then there's the approach of like our responsibility to organize a mass base and to do the most collectively with sort of as many people as we can. And so they don't necessarily have to be antithetical, but they could be.
And I know we are continuing in the form of being interactive with each other. I just wanted to read some of the guiding questions in the chat for our audience in person. After Dr. CBS posed the questions, moving from survival to thriving or flourishing, and how do these strategies, different strategies, work in ways that are antagonistic? Nia Evans shared, what are the concrete steps? What are the practicalities? What are the actual realities? Abena, you had shared in the chat, as we're framing Black peoples in the United States as internal colonies and reflecting on how to fortify the internal colony against racial capitalism, it seems to me the process of fortification for the purpose of self-determination could be thought of as building a maroon society. Ray then shared, our responsibility to one another is solidarity. Stephanie responded to that saying, building relationships and consciousness with each other. Kemi went on to share, safer if the boundaries of the maroon community are imperceptible from the outside. And JM shared, deep reflections happening here. Just wanted to remind us that Dr. CBS has asked us to come off mute if you're online, drop things in the chat, and if you're in person, I invite you to raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you if you have any questions or comments about what we're speaking on right now.
I had a comment that was not read out loud, which precedes your question, Dr. Burden Stelly, which is, I think we jump from surviving to thriving abstractly too often. So I guess the question that I'm thinking about is, it's very real that survival is, I don't even know what the right word is, but attempting survival is a reality that many people have. So and I get frustrated with conversations where we say like, well, let's not just talk about surviving, let's talk about thriving. Because to me the operative word there is talk. But for me it's, well, people have to survive. And so I guess in terms of concrete steps and in terms of thinking about financial governance, and I know you asked us, well, how do we define financial governance? Are there concrete steps that you can think of in terms of thinking of how does one survive and maybe try to achieve the aims of self-determination or financial governance while trying to survive?
Well, I mean, I think that that is more of a collective conversation, and to me that comes out of organizations, because it has to be, that's how it becomes grounded in a sort of in objectives, right? Strategy and objectives. But if you think about, I think we always have to be considering in our daily practice as ourselves, right, as members of community, thriving alongside surviving. And so I think a lot about like academic stuff, right? Because I'm in academia. So it's the difference between sort of sitting down and really not giving yourself enough time, for example, to write an essay, not giving yourself enough time and doing it at the last minute versus like being in a flow state. It's really the same material. It's really the same kind of tools, but it's a different orientation. And so to me, like the one thing about surviving versus thriving, it really is community. It really is kind of just doing the thing together. Because even if you are trying to make $1 out of 15 cents, so to speak, if you are doing it with people you love and care about, and you're doing it knowing that like somebody has your back and you're responsible to other people, to me that's a mindset of moving from survival to flourishing, even if the material conditions aren't yet there. And so there's something about collect collective and purpose that has to do with like flourishing. It's about caring for the things that you do have, like you might live in a community that is resource poor, but you can still care about that community, right? The way that you know, how do you treat the streets? How do you treat the people? Like, how do you treat the things in your community? And so it's sort of again, it's an orientation and an understanding that like there's a lot of suffering that's imposed upon us. We don't have to impose that upon ourselves. Like, we don't have to only move with the idea of like the bare minimum in mind.